Hello everyone, and welcome to another Star Trek Online video. Today, I'm going to try to tell you about firing modes. Now this video is aimed at new players who might not be aware of what a firing mode is and why you would want one. So what is a firing mode? Well, a firing mode is an ability that changes essentially how your weapons work in a way. And it increases your damage. That's what it comes down to. You always want to have a firing mode active if possible when you fire your weapons, because it results in you doing more damage. Now, the first firing mode that I can show you here is Beam's Overload 1. Now, Beam Overload essentially increases the base damage of your beams, while it decreases the firing rate. But the overall result is you just do more damage. Now, all those skills exist in 3 tiers essentially. Beam Overload 1 is an ensign skill, while Beam Overload 3 is a lieutenant commander skill. Now, versions 1 and 2 of a skill, you can just buy the manuals at an NPC, and if you wanna use the version 3, you need to either craft it yourself or buy it from the exchange. Make sure that your bridge officer is promoted to the required rank, or otherwise they can't learn this skill either. So, Beam Overload 3, as you can see, will just be a better version of Beam Overload, increasing your damage even further. Now, Beam Overload lasts for 10 seconds. It will also change the sound of your beams a bit, and the animation. But essentially, it's just doing more damage, but you're still just shooting a single target. Now, what's a bit different is Beam Fire at Will. Beam Fire at Will is an AoE attack, and essentially it decreases the damage of each of your shots, but you will shoot more often, also resulting in you doing more damage overall. Now, Beam Fire at Will also decreases your accuracy, which is not necessarily a problem. You can get accuracy from your skills. So there is, what's it called, targeting expertise gives you accuracy if you spec into that. There is a trait called accurate, like a space trait that you can get for free. There is, from the reputation, auxiliary power configuration, which gives you accuracy based on auxiliary power. Now you want your energy in weapons if you are using energy weapons, but you can use the remaining power that's not needed for weapons in auxiliary. There are also some other traits that might give you accuracy. So there are ways to deal with the loss of accuracy. There is also the option of just reducing the enemy's defense. Defense is mostly based on speed, so if you have crowd control, if you catch the enemy in a tractor beam, you will drastically reduce their defense, and therefore making accuracy less of an issue. So be aware, the Beam Fire at Will does reduce your accuracy, but there are usually ways around it. What it also does is, of course, it decreases your base damage, and that's not ideal, but it makes up for it by hitting more targets. Beam Fire at Will chooses its targets randomly, which means you kind of turn into a disco ball and hit everything around you, which doesn't matter that much in single player, but if you are together with a team, be aware that every enemy is going to look angrily at you because you hit absolutely everything, which can result into a rude awakening when they start shooting back. So this is a skill that's very popular with tanks. It can also be used to deal damage, but just be aware that you will get a lot of attention if you're using Beam Fire at Will. Now, as usual, the higher levels will improve the skill. You lose less base damage on a higher Beam Fire at Will. You also lose less accuracy. And it's not the best damage dealing skill in the game, but it is a good skill for tanking, and it helps if you deal with large amounts of enemies, right? Star Trek Online tends to throw a lot of enemies at you, and AoE skills just tend to perform really well because of that. Next, I want to have a look at cannon skills. Now, cannon skills actually start at the lieutenant level, meaning there is no ensign level cannon ability. And cannons, well, cannons affect single cannons, dual heavy cannons, also turrets. Turrets are cannons. And just like the beam skills improve all beams, the cannon skills improve all cannons. Now we have cannon rapid fire and cannon scatter volley, and once again we have a single target ability and an AoE ability. And the single target ability just increases your fire rate essentially, and well, you shoot faster, while scatter volley. Now scatter volley is a bit more interesting, because unlike beamfire at will, which just shoots random targets, scatter volley shoots targets like it hits targets in a cone around your primary target, right? So you select a target and you shoot at that, and then it hits 3 targets inside that cone. Now, by hitting 3 targets, you can already see you are essentially like tripling your damage, right? Which makes this a very powerful ability, assuming you're fighting a lot of enemies. It also makes this ability very strong together with Gravity Well. Gravity Well is a science skill that pulls enemies together, and then you have just one blob of enemies and you can just scatter volley in there, which is pretty great. Now, scatter volley also reduces your accuracy, but it does not reduce your base damage. And it gets even better. If you go to scatter volley 3, it actually increases your base damage and does damage to 3 targets. While cannon rapid fire, it also increases your base damage and your fire rate, but you're only hitting like 1 target. And as you can see, rapid fire doesn't increase your base damage by that much more. And 50% increased fire rate is obviously nice, but it's nowhere near as good as just hitting 3 targets. And considering the fact that you are mostly dealing with groups of enemies in this game, scatter volley is just amazing and is by many seen as the best damage skill, because it's just a very good skill. It's also in a way easy to improve, because there is a trait called Withering Fire, a trait that you can get for free from the Klingon recruitment event. And it increases the duration of cannon scatter volley. So instead of 10 seconds, it now lasts 14 seconds. And it's ability that you can use every 15 seconds if you have enough cooldown reduction. So you can essentially keep this permanently up. Now there are extensions for other firing modes as well, but the one for cannon scatter volley is just the easiest to come by. So those are essentially the energy weapon firing modes, or at least those are the basic ones. There is one other ability that I wanna, point at, and that's the intelligence one. Now, in intelligence, you have surgical strikes. Now, surgical strikes is a commander level, it's lieutenant commander or commander level ability, but surgical strikes 2 and 3 are both at the commander seat, and then surgical strikes 1 is at the lieutenant commander seat. Now, there is no reason to ever use surgical strikes 2, except the fact that I guess it's a little bit cheaper to acquire, because you can buy it at an NPC. But surgical strikes 3, it's a single target firing mode, but it increases the base damage of your weapons by a lot. It gives you vast amounts of crit chance and severity, and it even improves your accuracy. Also, it works for cannons and beams at the same time. So if you wanted to mix cannons and beams, surgical strike would help both of them. Problem obviously with surgical strikes is, besides it being single target, you need an intelligence specialization on your ship. Now, while each ship has essentially tactical science and engineering stations, specialization seats are rarer, I should say. Ships have at the maximum 2 specializations, and the specializations, especially on older ships, are not always on the commander seat, right? So this ship has an intelligence engineering commander seat. So that means I need to use an engineering officer here. But if that engineering officer is also trained in intelligence, I can then use intelligence abilities on it. So as you can see, I'm using a mixture of engineering and intelligence abilities here. I could also just equip engineering stuff here if I wanted to. But yeah, surgical strikes is certainly a fun ability. Technically, there are also in Miracle Worker there is exceed rated limits as a firing mode, but it's not the greatest, to be honest. I think Pilot has something as well. But yeah, you'll do fine if you just stick to the basics like Beam Overload or Beam Fire at Will or Cannon Scatter Volley or something like that. Now, what I can also mention is there are firing modes for torpedoes, and there are dispersal patterns for mines. The thing with torpedoes is it's not like it's just changing the next torpedo attack, right? This isn't like if you use Beam Overload for 10 seconds, all the beams that you fire will have the effect. But for a torpedo, it's like the next torpedo that you shoot will have the effect. There is Torpedo High Yield, which shoots multiple torpedoes at one target. Some torpedoes interact a bit different with High Yield and create like one big torpedo. And then there's Torpedo Spread, and Torpedo Spread essentially launches multiple torpedoes at, well, multiple targets. So there are the torpedo firing modes, and we have dispersal patterns for mines. I've personally never used mines, but in a specialized build you can get a lot of use out of them. Now, as I have mentioned earlier, certain traits can improve firing modes or can just interact with firing modes. For example, there is a trait called Superior Area Denial, which is very popular with carriers, and that essentially buffs your pets when you use either Fire at Will or Scatter Volley. So if you are building a carrier and you have that trait available, because it's not a very cheap trait to acquire. But if you had that trait and you wanted to use it on a carrier, then you would build that carrier around Fire at Will or Scatter Volley. And if you have certain traits unlocked that interact with a certain firing mode, then keep that in mind. It's usually beneficial to just choose one firing mode and build around it. Also because if you have enough cooldown reduction, all you need is one copy of a firing mode. A very popular trait for cooldown reduction is the Boimler effect. You can get this from low-buy store, and essentially it just has a chance to reduce all of your bridge officer cooldowns to its shared cooldowns whenever you use like an ability. Right now it only has a 17.5% chance to trigger, so it won't always trigger in every rotation, but it massively helps you cool down your bridge officer abilities, and you can add some other effects like the console from the winter event ship, which gives you passive cooldown reduction and so on. So essentially, people will usually only have one copy of the firing mode, like my ship here has one copy of Surgical Strikes 3, and you just try to keep that as, give that as much uptime as possible, right? And since this here takes a commander level slot, I couldn't even slot a second ability, right? I couldn't slot a Scatter Volley as well. And since I can only have one mode active, it would just be a waste of space in that way to bring two. But if you're a new player and you don't have that much cooldown reduction and you don't have any traits that synergize with your firing mode, you can bring like a Beam Overload and a Beam Fire at Will on the same ship if you're using beams, and then just switch around and see what you like more or use them depending on the situation. So build your ship the way you want, experiment with them, but eventually you probably will find a firing mode and you might get some accessories that buff that firing mode, and then you will likely stick with one. But the most important part is pick a firing mode and use it to increase your damage output, right? And that's also why in most cases ships are built around either beams or cannons, because if you're using beams, you use a beam firing mode, and if you're using cannons, you use a cannon firing mode. And if you want to mix them, if you have like a surgical strike ship, you can do that. But otherwise, like you could obviously run beam, overload and rapid fire on the same ship, but now you're using even more space on your bridge officer abilities that could be filled with something else, like for example an attack pattern beta, which debuffs the enemies, right? So instead of running like beam overload and rapid fire, you'd be running like one of those. You'd be choosing like only beams and be running then beam overload, and then you'd run attack pattern beta and debuff the enemies as well. So there is that. So yeah, I hope this was helpful to some people. So when you build your ship, keep firing modes in mind and make sure you have one equipped. Try them out and have some fun. Hope you guys enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time.